The wind howled across the frozen airfield, carrying with it the metallic scent of fuel and the faint hum of an engine straining against the cold. Snow gathered in quiet drifts around the strange machine waiting in the dark, a shape half mechanical, half absurd. It was a tank, unmistakably, its treads coated in frost. Yet rising from its steel frame were wings, enormous and skeletal, stretching outward into the night. Men stood in silence, their breath fogged in the dim light of search lamps. Some watched with awe, others with quiet horror. No one spoke. Somewhere beyond the runway, an old bomber roared to life, its engines coughing, then screaming. The cable between the two machines grew taut. The experiment that no one truly believed in was about to begin. In that moment, no one could have imagined they were witnessing one of the strangest triumphs of human invention, a tank that would fly. The world had forgotten this night for decades. It was buried in Soviet archives, dismissed as rumor, a myth told by soldiers who swore they had seen the impossible. But years later, the truth would surface. In the middle of the Second World War, a Soviet engineer named Oleg Antonov built a flying tank. And not only that it worked. This is not a story of glory or conquest. It is a story of desperation, of a nation that refused to die, and of a man who refused to accept the limits of earthbound machines. It is a story that begins with war. The year was 1942. Germany had carved deep into the heart of the Soviet Union. The city of Kharkov was gone. Sevastopol was gone. The front stretched thousands of miles, a bleeding wound across the east. The Red Army was losing tanks faster than they could be built. Rail lines had been bombed, bridges destroyed, roads swallowed by snow and mud. Entire divisions found themselves cut off isolated pockets of soldiers without armor, without hope. They needed tanks. Not in weeks, not in months, but now. And there was only one way to get them there. Through the sky. It was madness, but madness was something the Soviet Union had learned to use. Behind the chaos, a new idea began to take shape. If men could be dropped by parachute, why not machines? Why not give the Red Army a weapon that could fall from the heavens, land behind enemy lines, and keep fighting? One man believed it could be done. Oleg Antonov was 36 years old and already known as one of the Soviet Union's most brilliant glider designers. He had spent his youth chasing wind over open fields, building fragile wings out of wood and canvas. To him, flight was not just a miracle, it was a problem to be solved, a pattern to be discovered. He believed that anything could fly if it had the right shape, the right lift, the right courage behind it. Even a tank. When he proposed the idea, most officials laughed. A tank that could fly? It sounded like a bad joke whispered in a factory line. But Antonov's conviction was disarming. He didn't talk like a dreamer. He talked like an engineer. He told them that with enough wing surface, a light T-60 tank could be made airborne. It would need to be towed by a bomber, yes, but once released, it could glide to the ground, detach its wings, and roll straight into battle. They called it the Krylia tanker. The tank with wings. And somehow, permission was granted. The Soviet command gave Antonov a small factory, a single tank, and a handful of men. No extra resources, no special privilege, only time, which was already running out. Inside the freezing hangar, they began the impossible. Mechanics stripped the T-60 to its bare essentials, tearing away anything that wasn't necessary. Armor plates were removed. The gun shortened. The turret thinned to the point of fragility. Every kilogram mattered. They measured and weighed everything: the bolts, the glass, the handles. What remained was a hollow shell of steel, light enough to dream. The wings were built from pine and canvas, 40 feet wide, attached to the tank's hull by metal braces. A long tail boom extended from the back like the spine of a dragonfly. It looked ridiculous. But Antonov didn't care about how it looked. He cared about whether it would fly. The day of the test was clear and bitterly cold. The sun never fully rose. The TB-3 bomber, ancient and heavy, waited at the edge of the field, its engines rumbling like a beast half asleep. The tank sat behind it, connected by a steel cable. In the cockpit, the pilot, a young test flyer named Sergei Anakin, fastened his harness and whispered a prayer. He had no illusions about what he was attempting. This was not a mission. It was a dare. The engines roared. Snow whipped around the machines as they began to move. Slowly at first, then faster. The cable tightened, jerking the tank forward. The wings trembled, straining against the wind. For a heartbeat, the whole assembly shook as though about to tear itself apart. Then it happened. The treads left the ground. The tank lifted. For one extraordinary moment, the laws of war gave way to the laws of flight. The bomber strained above, engines screaming under the drag, but the tank held steady. It glided behind, wings humming, snowfields sliding silently beneath its shadow. Anakin would later say that it was the most terrifying and beautiful thing he had ever done. He could feel every vibration of the wooden wings, every shift in the cold air. He pulled the release lever. The cable snapped free. The bomber roared ahead into the night, leaving the tank alone in the sky. He guided it gently downward. The white expanse of the airfield rushed closer. The treads struck once, twice, and then it rolled to a stop, snow exploding around it like smoke. The wings sagged but held. Silence followed. The engineers ran toward it, shouting, laughing, crying. For the first time in history, a tank had flown. No newspaper would ever report it. No headline would celebrate it. The project would be hidden, its records sealed. Yet for those who stood on that runway, it was a glimpse into a future that might have been a moment when steel and sky met and did not break. And as the snow began to fall again, covering the tire tracks, no one noticed the way Antonov stared at the horizon. He wasn't smiling. He was already thinking of the next machine, the next flight, the next impossible dream waiting to be born. In the months that followed, the story of the flying tank spread quietly through the corridors of Soviet design bureaus. Most who heard it thought it a joke, a rumor born from exhaustion and vodka. But for those who had stood in that freezing airfield, it was real. They had seen it glide. They had heard the soft hum of wind over wood and steel. They had watched the impossible take shape and lift into the night. Yet history has little patience for miracles. The war did not slow down to admire them. The official report reached Moscow with dry precision. The flight of the Antonov A-40 was successful. The tank glided and landed safely. However, towing places excessive strain on the bomber. Project deemed impractical under current conditions. And that was it. A paragraph to summarize months of sleepless work, 1,000 hopes, and one perfect moment that vanished into the snow. But war was never kind to dreamers. By the time Antonov's report crossed the desks of the Air Force Command, Stalingrad was burning. The Red Army was clawing back inch by inch what had been lost. The skies were filled not with prototypes, but with German bombers. The priority was survival, not wonder. Still, the dream had happened once, and it had changed something inside Antonov. He had learned that weight was an illusion, that even steel could float if treated like a secret. He carried that lesson quietly through the years that followed, through every setback, every order, every night spent drafting wings no one asked for. In a notebook dated late 1943, Antonov scribbled a line that historians would find decades later. A tank can fly once. A nation must learn to do it forever. What he meant, no one could say for certain. But his colleagues noticed that he began designing differently. He no longer thought of airplanes as shells for engines. He thought of them as creatures of burden, meant to lift and carry impossible things. That idea would become his life's work. But back in 1942, in that first bitter winter, he was still just another engineer with too many ideas and too little material. The tank that flew sat quietly in a hangar, its wooden wings stacked against a wall, the canvas stiff with cold. Soldiers sometimes came to stare at it. They would run their hands along the edges, laugh, shake their heads, and move on. The war offered no time for imagination. Anakin, the test pilot, was transferred to another base. He flew supply missions, gliders, and later fighter planes. Once in a letter to Antonov, he wrote, "That night I saw the Earth differently. I looked down and thought how small it all was. A tank has no right to be up there, but for a few seconds it was free." Those few seconds, as brief as they were, would haunt Antonov for the rest of his life. Because in those seconds, he had seen what few ever see, a glimpse of what humanity could become when necessity erases the line between genius and insanity. Outside the laboratory, the war continued to devour everything. Entire cities disappeared. Families vanished into smoke. The front crept westward again, mile by mile, built on blood and cold resolve. In the middle of it all, Antonov and his men were reassigned to design gliders for cargo transport projects that demanded less imagination and more obedience. He worked quietly. He never spoke of the A-40 again, not to his superiors, not even to his closest engineers. But he kept the blueprints rolled under his bed, a secret reminder that in the darkest hours of war, he had proven that flight could belong to anything that dared to defy gravity. The flying tank had been born of desperation, but what it left behind was faith in the idea that the limits of the possible are nothing but suggestions written by those too afraid to test them. Years later, when Antonov would go on to design the world's largest aircraft, when his name would echo in the roar of engines stretching across the skies of a new century, people would call him a visionary. They would speak of his genius in tones of reverence. But Antonov never saw himself that way. He saw himself as a man who had once, in a winter that nearly broke his country, made the earth rise to meet the sky and proved, if only for a moment, that even in war, wonder can still exist. The A-40 was never built again. No second prototype, no production model, no squadron of winged tanks descending through the clouds. The single test unit was dismantled for parts. Its wooden wings were burned for heat. Its stripped-down hull was melted for steel and turned into bullets. All that remained were memories and one black and white photograph, grainy and half forgotten, showing a tank with wings resting on snow. For those who saw that photograph decades later, it looked like a myth, like something out of a dream. But those who knew the truth understood. They knew that it had been real. That on one frozen night, humanity's obsession with flight had reached its most improbable frontier and succeeded. And though the war would bury it beneath greater horrors, the story of the Soviet flying tank endures, whispering from the past. That sometimes the most extraordinary acts of courage are not born on the battlefield, but in the quiet defiance of those who dare to imagine what should be impossible. In the years that followed, the war consumed everything. What had once been a secret experiment, whispered about in the corners of design bureaus, vanished beneath the avalanche of larger victories and heavier losses. The Battle of Kursk, the Siege of Leningrad, the push toward Berlin, each new headline buried the memory of that frozen airfield a little deeper. But some memories refused to die. Oleg Antonov carried the image of the flying tank with him like a ghost. When the Red Army finally crossed into Germany, when the banners were raised and the cannons fell silent, he did not celebrate. He sat alone in his office, turning over a single photograph, the A-40 on the runway, its wings wide as hope, its shadow long across the snow. He had proven that steel could fly, but he had also learned that war rarely rewards miracles. The Soviet Union emerged from the ashes with scars that would last generations. Cities lay in ruins. Villages were gone. Millions never returned home. Yet amid the grief, something else had survived the relentless hunger to rebuild, to rise again, to outdo every nation that had ever dared to stand against it. The Cold War was beginning, and the race for the skies had only just started. Antonov's mind never stopped moving. He was older now, sharper, quieter. The boy who once chased gliders across the Ukrainian countryside had become the man designing giants for the motherland. His new aircraft were unlike anything the world had seen. Wings that could lift entire cities, engines that could carry armies. Where others saw airframes, Antonov saw wings large enough to carry nations' dreams. When he presented his first post-war designs, the N2, the N8, later the N22, the officials nodded approvingly. They saw practicality, power, and size. What they did not see was the spirit of that winter night in 1942, still alive inside each blueprint. To them, it was engineering. To Antonov, it was vindication. He never forgot the lessons of the A-40. Every beam, every rivet, every curve of his new aircraft carried echoes of that impossible glider. He designed them to lift massive loads, to land on rough fields, to survive where other planes could not. The dream that began as a flying tank had become something greater, the dream of flight without limitation. One evening, years after the war, a young engineer in Antonov's bureau asked him about the story. "Comrade," the man said cautiously, "is it true that you once made a tank fly?" Antonov smiled. For a moment, his eyes drifted somewhere far away, back to the blinding snow, the roar of engines, the tremor of wooden wings. "It's true," he said softly, "but we didn't build it to win the war. We built it to prove that even in war, we could still dream." The young engineer laughed, thinking he was joking. But Antonov wasn't. He never was. He knew that the future of aviation, of all invention, belonged to those willing to ignore laughter. The world had mocked his tank, just as it would later mock his massive transport planes. Yet time would prove him right. The Antonov Design Bureau would go on to build the largest aircraft ever to fly, the N-225 Mriya, the dream, an aircraft so vast that it could carry other planes inside its body. It was, in many ways, the final echo of that first impossible machine. The dream had grown, evolved, and survived. The tank with wings had found its rebirth in the sky of dreams. But none of that mattered on the night it began. On that frozen field in 1942, Antonov had not been building history. He had been building hope. History is written by victories, but progress is written by attempts. Between the failures and the triumphs lie the moments that define what it means to be human. The willingness to risk everything for the chance to touch the sky. For the Soviet Union, the A-40 was a footnote. For Antonov, it was a promise kept to himself, to his country, to the idea that no material, no weight, no doubt could silence the human urge to rise. Years later, when the archives were opened and the photograph of the flying tank resurfaced, historians struggled to believe their eyes. Some said it had to be fake. Others called it propaganda. But those who looked closer saw the details that only truth carries: the fabric stretched tight across the wings, the cold gleam of steel, the tracks half buried in snow. It was no illusion. It had happened. And as the image spread across the world, people felt the same strange awe that Antonov's engineers had felt that night. Awe at what people can build when they refuse to accept that something is impossible. The A-40 was gone. Its remains melted down, its wings burned for warmth. But ideas, once airborne, never truly land. They keep drifting, searching for someone else to find them, someone else to build them again. Perhaps that is what Antonov understood better than anyone: that flight was never about escaping gravity. It was about escaping disbelief. And so the story of the flying tank remains not as a monument to madness, but as a quiet testament to imagination, the kind of imagination that survives war, that outlives empires, that makes the ground itself seem temporary. Somewhere in that silent snow, the tank still waits, wings folded, eyes toward the horizon, ready for a sky that will always remember the night it flew. By the late 1950s, the Soviet Union was no longer a nation clawing for survival. It was a superpower aiming for the heavens. The factories that once forged tanks now built rockets. Steel that had been molded into bullets was being stretched into fuselages for spacecraft. The war had ended, but the hunger to conquer the sky had not. And in that new age of ambition, Antonov stood quietly apart. He did not chase glory or politics. He built, always building. His designs no longer looked like the fragile gliders of his youth, but the philosophy had never changed. Lift, balance, patience, those were the constants. Each new aircraft he drew seemed to echo a single idea: make the impossible practical. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiment, though sometimes, when the younger engineers gathered around him in the evening, he would smile faintly and tell them, "Every great aircraft begins as something ridiculous." They would laugh, assuming he was being modest. But he was speaking from memory. He had seen ridiculous things take flight. The Antonov Bureau's planes began to dominate Soviet logistics. The An-12, the An-22, and finally the monumental An-124 carried tanks, missiles, even other planes. The irony wasn't lost on Antonov. The tank that once needed wings now flew inside his wings. What had been a dream of necessity had become a tool of dominance. Yet the older he grew, the more Antonov seemed haunted by that first night. There was something pure in the madness of it, something honest that the vast, polished machines of the modern age no longer had. The A-40 had been crude, fragile, and untested, but it had also been fearless. In its brief, fragile flight, he saw something that the massive cargo giants could never recapture: innocence. When asked once about the future of aviation, Antonov replied, "We will keep building larger, faster, stronger. But one day we will remember that the sky does not care about size. It only answers courage." For him, courage had been a T-60 tank scraping through the clouds with wooden wings and a prayer. Time, however, has a way of covering courage in dust. The Cold War produced its own miracles: supersonic jets, space capsules, orbiting stations. The flying tank seemed too small, too primitive, too foolish to matter anymore. It slipped into obscurity again, known only to a handful of historians and aviation enthusiasts who whispered its name like a secret. Then came the rediscovery. In the early 1990s, as the Soviet Union dissolved, its archives began to open. Reporters and scholars from across the world flooded Moscow and Kiev, digging through boxes of forgotten files. Among them was a young historian named Yuri Pavlenko, searching for documents on experimental gliders. He expected nothing more than a few sketches. What he found instead was a folder marked simply A-40. Inside were blueprints, flight reports, and a handful of photographs, the proof that the legend was real. Pavlenko would later say that when he saw the photo for the first time, he felt the same disbelief as those who had built it. It looked like a hallucination, a tank with wings, but the paper smelled of oil and smoke. You could almost feel the war in it. Within a few years, the story spread across the world. Aviation magazines published the images. Historians debated the details. Skeptics called it a hoax until eyewitness accounts began to surface: letters, diaries, testimonies from engineers who had worked with Antonov. The evidence was overwhelming. The A-40 had flown, however briefly, and its creator had gone on to change the course of aviation forever. Museums requested replicas. Model builders reconstructed it from the surviving plans. In Ukraine, where Antonov's company still stood, a small group of engineers built a scale model as a tribute to their founder. They painted it the same dull green as the original T-60. When it was unveiled, veterans who had served in the war stood before it in silence. One of them, an old mechanic with trembling hands, reached out and touched the wooden wing. "We thought he was crazy," he whispered. "Turns out he was just ahead of us." For a while, the flying tank became a symbol again, a reminder of what human imagination can produce when everything else is gone. Schools used it as an example of wartime ingenuity. Documentaries showed it as a curiosity, a strange footnote of history. But for those who looked deeper, it was never just a curiosity. It was a message. The A-40 proved that invention doesn't always require reason. Sometimes it requires desperation. Sometimes it requires faith. Even now, decades later, the photograph still circulates online, often mistaken for art, sometimes for myth. Yet the truth remains simple and undeniable. It happened. A real tank, built for war, rose from the ground and sailed through the cold Soviet sky. It flew because one man refused to accept the limits of his world. It flew because imagination is its own kind of defiance. It flew because, somewhere in every generation, there are a few who will always look at the heaviest thing in their lives and ask, what if it could fly? When Antonov died in 1984, his colleagues placed a single photograph on his desk, the one of the A-40 resting on the snow. They left it there during the funeral. No medals, no speeches, just that picture. Because in the end, that was all that needed to be said. He had made a tank fly. And in doing so, he had proved something eternal: that every boundary drawn by fear can be crossed by courage, and that even the weight of war cannot keep a dream from taking off. Winter returned to Kiev the year after Antonov's death, the kind of cold that quiets the city and turns the streets to mirrors of ice. The design bureau that bore his name continued to hum with the sound of drafting machines and coffee cups. His office remained untouched. The blueprints were still rolled tight on the table. The photograph of the flying tank stayed pinned to the wall, a small rectangle of history holding its breath in the stillness. Young engineers came and went, whispering about the man who had once put wings on a tank. To them, he was a legend, a name from textbooks and documentaries. They could not imagine the chaos of the 1940s, the hunger, the smoke, the sense that the world might end tomorrow. They designed on computers now. They talked about composites, satellites, space cargo. But when they looked at that photograph, something stirred. It was not the machine itself that haunted them, but the idea behind it, the audacity to try when the world was collapsing. The A-40 had no tactical legacy, no strategic value, no successor in any military manual. Yet it lingered like a ghost in every blueprint that dared to reach too far. The flying tank was proof that imagination could survive even inside the machinery of war. As the decades passed, the legend spread farther than Antonov could ever have dreamed. Model builders in Germany crafted miniature replicas. American museums requested the original drawings. In Japan, a documentary recreated the flight in digital form. Online, the photo of the winged tank became a fascination, an image too surreal to believe, too honest to deny. Some viewers thought it was an art installation, a parody of wartime invention. Others felt something deeper, the awe of human stubbornness, the beauty in our refusal to stop reaching upward. And somewhere beneath the noise of history, the truth remained simple. The A-40 had lifted off once briefly, precariously, but undeniably. It had tasted the wind. It had left the earth. In the great museums of aviation, among the gleaming jets and sleek rockets, there is rarely a place for failure. Curators prefer the machines that won wars, broke records, or changed economies. But the A-40 does not belong to victory. It belongs to courage. It belongs to the moment when a man facing the limits of physics decided that the only real failure would be not to try. If you listen to the veterans who were there, the story always ends the same way. They do not talk about the design, the calculations, the wings, or the drag coefficients. They talk about the silence after the cable snapped, the moment when the tank was alone in the sky. They talk about the feeling that something impossible had just happened, and how for a heartbeat every man on that airfield forgot about the war. But silence has outlived them all. It hums quietly beneath every leap of human invention, the whisper that says maybe, just maybe, this will work. Today, when the last surviving photograph of the Antonov A-40 circulates across screens, it does not look like a relic. It looks like a promise. Against the white snow, the tank seems almost weightless, its wooden wings open like the pages of a book left halfway through. You can almost see the breath of the men who built it, the spark of a moment when the impossible bent for just long enough to let them pass. The Soviet flying tank did not change the outcome of the war. It did not rewrite strategy or alter history's maps. But it did something far rarer. It reminded humanity that even in its darkest hours, it could still look up. And that, perhaps, is what endures most of all. The idea that courage does not always roar across the sky with fire and engines. Sometimes it creaks on wooden wings, trembling in the cold, rising just high enough to prove that even the heaviest dreams can fly. There are moments in history when invention stops belonging to the people who create it. It drifts beyond blueprints and laboratories, beyond the borders of nations and the calculations of generals. It becomes something else, a symbol, a fragment of truth that speaks to anyone willing to listen. The Antonov A-40 had become exactly that. In the eyes of historians, it was an experiment, a curiosity, a dead end in the long march of aviation. But in the imagination of those who learned its story, it was a heartbeat proof that courage could take shape in metal and canvas. Every generation seemed to find it again, as if drawn to its strange defiance. The young engineers who stumbled upon that photograph in archives or on glowing screens didn't see a failed prototype. They saw themselves. Because every dreamer in every century has faced the same laughter. The laughter of those who say, it can't be done. The same laughter Antonov had heard echoing through the hangar when he told them a tank would fly. And perhaps that is why his story still resonates. The flying tank is not remembered for what it achieved, but for what it represented: the refusal to surrender imagination to fear. In the quiet of his later years, Antonov once wrote, "Every man has his own sky. Some build ladders, others build wings." He built both. For all its absurdity, the A-40 was the blueprint for an idea that would change everything. The belief that any obstacle can become a runway. That faith carried through every aircraft he would ever design, from the smallest trainer to the largest cargo giant that would one day carry the world's heaviest machines across continents. Decades later, when the N-225 Mriya, the dream lifted from the runway for the first time, engineers and journalists watched in awe. Its wings stretched wider than a football field. Its engines thundered like the heart of a planet. Yet in a strange way, its first flight was not new at all. It was the same story, told again on a grander scale, the weight of the impossible rising from the ground, the same defiance, the same quiet whisper that said, "Let's see if it can fly." Those who knew Antonov's past couldn't help but smile. The flying tank had been reborn, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of creation instead of destruction. What had begun as an act of war ended as a gesture of peace, of human possibility. The dream that once wore armor had become the dream that carried the world. But the skies have long memories. They do not forget who dared to reach them first. Today, when the last surviving fragments of the A-40 story are told, when the photograph surfaces again, when the old film flickers in black and white, it is no longer about a nation or a war. It's about the thin line between failure and faith. It's about what happens when a human being looks at something impossible and refuses to look away. And perhaps that's the greatest inheritance Antonov left behind: not his aircraft, not his factories, not the empire of steel and wings he built, but the example of that winter night when reason said no and courage answered yes. Because courage, like flight, begins with a fall. And for one man in a frozen field, in a world burning with war, that fall became the first step toward the sky. Snow falls again in the memory, soft and soundless. The year is gone, the war long over, yet the airfield still lives somewhere in the mind, a stretch of white under a black sky, a single tank with its strange wings, the hiss of wind over canvas. The light from the hangar windows trembles across the snow, and for a moment it feels as though the world is holding its breath again. There are no cameras now, no generals, no orders. Only the echo of that first engine, and the quiet heartbeat of a dream about to lift. It rises slowly, almost unwillingly, the way hope always does after ruin. The tank leaves the earth once more not as metal or machine, but as memory. The wings unfurl, the night opens, and for a brief heartbeat, gravity remembers mercy. This is where history always ends and meaning begins. The Antonov A-40 was built to solve a problem of war. It was meant to bring armor to soldiers, power to battlefields, a weapon to those stranded behind enemy lines. But what it carried instead was far heavier and far greater. Proof that imagination survives even in the darkest places. Proof that humanity, no matter how brutal the world becomes, never stops trying to rise. They called it foolish. They called it impossible. Yet it flew, and in that brief flight, something eternal happened, something that outlasted empires, ideologies, and flags. Because the truth is, history doesn't remember what the machine accomplished. It remembers what it meant. It remembers the silence after the roar, the disbelief that turned to wonder, the faces of men who watched a tank become a bird. Decades later, children would see that same photograph in textbooks and wonder if it was real. Artists would paint it, engineers would analyze it, dreamers would whisper about it, and all of them, in their own way, would feel the same thing Antonov felt on that frozen night, the trembling awe of seeing the ground fall away. Some inventions change the world. Others remind us why we build one. The flying tank did both, and even now, in some quiet corner of the sky, you can almost imagine it still gliding slow, steady, unafraid over fields that no longer burn, across borders that no longer matter, carried not by engines but by belief. That night in 1942 was not about a machine. It was about a truth. That even when the world is at war, even when everything around us sinks into darkness, someone, somewhere, will look up and try to make the earth itself take flight. The snow falls again. The air is still. And for a moment, you can almost see it. A tank with wings, hovering against the night, weightless, eternal proof that the human spirit, no matter how heavy, was always meant to fly. The snow has long since melted from that forgotten airfield, but the story of what happened there endures past quietly from engineer to historian, from photograph to imagination. What remains of the Antonov A-40 is not the machine itself, but the echo of its defiance. It was born in hunger and fear, in a world unraveling under war. Yet it was built by hands that still believed in possibility. The men who gathered around that strange hybrid of steel and wood were not thinking about glory. They were thinking about survival, and somehow, through that desperation, they reached something almost sacred. For less than a minute, the weight of the impossible lifted from the earth. The wind carried the sound of canvas wings and creaking rivets. The bomber strained ahead, and below it, a tank something meant only for the ground found grace. That moment should have vanished with the snow. But it didn't. It became a reminder of what invention truly means. Not perfection, not victory, but the courage to try when there is no reason to believe. Every engineer since then, every designer who has ever stared at a blank sheet and thought this can't be done, has lived under the quiet inheritance of that night. Because it is never really about the machine. It is about the refusal to stop imagining. When Antonov died, his colleagues placed a single photograph on his desk, the flying tank resting on its frozen runway, wings stretched as though waiting for another attempt. It was small, grainy, and miraculous. In it was everything he stood for: vision born from necessity, hope born from ruin, the refusal to let gravity have the last word. We remember wars by their destruction, but sometimes their truest legacy is the invention born within them. The A-40 did not change the course of battle, but it changed what people thought was possible. It whispered that even the heaviest things can rise, that no idea is too strange if it dares to move. Today, the photograph lives on in museums and archives, shared across screens and headlines, disbelieved and rediscovered with every generation. And each time, someone looks at it and feels a spark small, bright, ancient, the same spark that drove a man to bolt wings onto a tank and aim for the clouds. That is the real flight of the Antonov A-40. Not the few seconds it spent in the air, but the decades it has spent reminding us what courage looks like. Because courage, like flight, never lasts forever. It simply begins again, wherever someone decides that gravity is only a suggestion. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the sky, the tank is still gliding slow, steady, and free, carrying with it the most human truth of all, that nothing is too heavy for hope.